Welcome to our next discipleship class. So, we have been going through evidence for the New Testament. We talked about some of the transmission of the New Testament and the early testimony of those documents in comparison with everything else really that exists in ancient literature. And obviously, the New Testament far surpasses anything in the ancient world. Now, in our 7 E's, we've come to E number 2, which is eyewitness testimony. So let's take a look at that. So eyewitness testimony really puts the historical crosshairs right on the text. So it says in Luke 3, now in the 15th year, and the pieces that are underlined here, they are the pieces that are showing you that if you're writing something at that time, naming these places and these people and this particular era, it would be impossible for it not to be considered historically accurate, especially the more people you name in what they're doing. So Luke says, now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and the region of Trachonitis, and Licinius, tetrarch of Abilene, while Annas and Caiaphas were high priests, the word of God came to John, the son of Zacharias, in the wilderness. Now, interesting, he names both Annas and Caiaphas the high priest because the other one was actually still... though the responsibility had been passed on, the original high priest had actually more respect at that point in time, so he actually lists both of them. Now, does this sound like Luke's making up a story? Of course not. This isn't mythological. This is exact. He gives you an exact date in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. He gives you 8 different people that are known from history outside the Bible. All were known to live at the exact same time. This is not a once upon a time story myth that the Bible is often made out to be. So, in Acts, though I'll fly through them because there's really no need to read each one of them. I do that in class, but here online, it'll take us forever. But in Acts, we have 84 historically confirmed eyewitness details. So Acts is the second book that Luke wrote. Luke includes several others in his gospel, which is the first book he wrote. John, the apostle, gives us 59 historically confirmed or historically probable eyewitness details. And the New Testament documents cite more than 30 people confirmed by secular sources or archaeology. Now, I want to say something. Archaeology has never reversed anything in the Bible. Nobody's dug something up and said, oh, see, the Bible's a sham. Everything that is dug up, everything uncovered, everything discovered, only confirms the Bible. It never counteracts it. So these are obviously very little. But there's the ones in red I typically share with classes. I mean, obviously, this would take us some time. But even if you look at number 4, the unusual but correct declension of the name Lystra. Now, all this is actually quoted in I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, so that's why I always recommend the book. Again, I pick out the red ones because I think they're pretty interesting, and I read these through in class, but I'm just going to kind of pop through them here. If you want to look at any of them, you can kind of freeze the screen if you want to. But these are the 84 that are listed, and I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. So, now, Luke reports a total of 35 miracles in the same book in which he records all 84 of these historically confirmed details. And if we look, this is what it says, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. It says, now, why would Luke be so accurate with trivial details like wind directions, water depths, and peculiar town names, but not be accurate when it comes to important events like miracles, in light of the fact that Luke has proven accurate with so many trivial details? It is nothing but pure anti-supernatural bias to say he's not telling the truth about the miracles he records. As we have seen, such a bias is illegitimate. This is a theistic world where miracles are possible, so it makes much more sense to believe Luke's miracle accounts than to discount them. In other words, Luke's credentials as a historian have been proven on so many points that it takes more faith not to believe his miracle accounts than to believe them. And I think that this is important for us to see because it's part of the issue here. Now, these are the 59 accounts that are listed by John in his gospel. And again, flipping through these, we can't go through each of the 59. They are here. You can freeze the screen and take a look at some of the red ones that I typically will emphasize when I'm in a class situation. But for our purposes, we just need to move through the presentation and get to the end. So now again, that final paragraph from the same book, it says, when we couple John's knowledge of Jesus' personal conversation with these nearly 60 historically confirmed or historically probable details, is there any doubt that John was an eyewitness or at least had access to eyewitness testimony? It certainly seems to us, and that's Norm Geisler and Frank Turek, that it takes a lot more faith not to believe John's gospel than to believe it. So I think, again, they've done a tremendous job, and I highly recommend the book. As a matter of fact, I give it away as a witnessing tool. I think it's really good because people need to read it. Now, again, this is shown in the book. New Testament documents cite more than 30 people confirmed by secular sources or archaeology. So again, this gives you kind of a bird's eye view. These are historical persons that appear in the New Testament. Now, you don't start putting actual people numerous times in a mythological story because the story gets disbanded immediately as fictitious. And that's actually what happened in the 2nd century, not only the first, but in the 2nd century, when they tried to take a lot of the Gnostic Gospels and all the other dribble that comes out and then try to pull it into the 1st century or pretend it was from an apostle when it actually wasn't. They stick apostles' names on them to give them some credibility. However, they come too late in the game. The apostles were long dead. And, at that point, it does become a mythological story. But anyways, these are 31 people that are listed in the New Testament. So that's eyewitnesses. Now, next is embarrassing testimony. This is testimony that if you were going to promote somebody and lie about them, you would only say what is very positive and bringing them really to a place where people would be more inclined to believe. But what the New Testament does is it just records what happened, and some of what was recorded, because it was actually happening, is embarrassing. And so we'll see what that means. For example, about the disciples, it tells us they were dim-witted, right? They fail to understand what Jesus is saying a number of times. They're uncaring, right? They fall asleep on Jesus twice. They make no effort to give Jesus a proper burial. They're rebuked, right? Peter is called Satan in Mark 8 and Matthew 16. Paul rebukes Peter about being wrong about a theological issue in Galatians 2. He wasn't living the gospel properly when he went and ate with the Jews and abandoned the Gentiles. So, again, these are not the kind of details that you want to put out if you're just trying to convince people. These are actual events because the Bible is recording actual history, and history isn't always favorable to the people that we consider heroes. Now, in a lot of pagan literature, they only record what's good. They never record any of the failures or what's bad. That's typically avoided. So Peter denies Christ 3 times because showing that he was a coward. The disciples run away when they took Jesus out of the garden, when they arrested him on that night. The women are the brave ones. They're the ones that show up at the tomb. Again, this is not the way you do it, especially when you're trying to get this word out. In that culture, women were not considered the credible witnesses that men were. They are doubters, right? Despite being taught several times that Jesus would rise from the dead, and those are the verses, the disciples are doubtful when they hear of his resurrection from the women. I mean, come on. Some are even doubtful after they see him risen, right? Like Thomas. So, Jesus was considered out of his mind by his own family who came to seize him, to take him home. They said, "You're beside yourself." I mean, again, this is not the stuff that you put out there if you're just trying to convince people. He was deserted by many of his followers. Everybody but the apostles really left him in John 6:66, and he had just fed 5,000. He was not believed by his own brothers, really, until probably after the resurrection. He was thought to be a deceiver. He turned off Jewish believers to the point they wanted to stone him, and that happened more than one time. He was accused of being demon-possessed and mad, right, by the Jewish leaders. He was called a drunkard. He was called demon-possessed. He had his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute. And again, these are things that actually caused him to be despised by leadership, and they question how could he understand, or how could he be promoting himself as a prophet or the Messiah if these are the things that he's doing. He was crucified despite the fact that anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse. Now, obviously, that's because he took the curse of the law for us. And again, there's nothing wrong with being with sinners. Those are the people he tried to reach. There's nothing wrong with a prostitute showing him honor and respect. But again, their bias told them that if he was dealing with people that were sinners in a way that was friendly and accommodating, then there must be something wrong with him. Well, that's who he came to save, sinners, us. So here's Turk.
Hey, Brian.
How's it going?
Good.
So, great presentation. You left me with enough things that I want to respond to that if I did, we would be here all night. So I'll just narrow it down.
Brian's the head of the Secular Student Alliance, so there you go. We had dinner, so
yeah.
Say hi to Brian. There you go.
Hey, SSA.
Hey, Brian. Go ahead.
So yeah, there's just a couple points I want to, I guess, focus on that really stood out to me. So you put a lot of emphasis on the embarrassing details.
Yeah.
So I have a couple points that I just want to list out real quick and then just get your response to.
Sure.
There's a number of examples in ancient mythology that of embarrassing details. Like, for example, in the account of Hercules, he has a fit of rage and kills his family. In the writings of Homer, well, not really writings, but in the works of Homer, Odysseus's men, his soldiers, are often presented as a bunch of bumbling idiots who get him in trouble. And then, of course, Josephus uses women as source material when he's writing the Jewish war, like in his account of Gamala, for example. And so I'm just wondering if we know that an ancient writer who lived in Jerusalem, or at least in Israel around the time of Jesus, who was a respected historian, used women, then doesn't that mean that women occasionally were trusted as historical sources? And then the presence of embarrassing details of characters and heroes in, like, for example, Greek mythology, doesn't that kind of...
Well, yeah, when you're talking about mythology, or just like a novel, yeah, you're going to have a lot of embarrassing details. That's what it's about. It's about making it more interesting if it's a novel.
So then my question is, how does that serve as a standard for what's historically accurate if it also occurs in mythology?
Well, because the embarrassing detail argument doesn't stand alone. It stands with all the other E's that I put up there, okay?
Well,
which shows that they're not writing mythology. They're writing what they believe to be true, and then they go and die for it.
Right, so I understand that you can build a case for the resurrection, or you can build a case for the historical reliability of the New Testament Gospels on the basis of these other criteria, but then the embarrassing detail kind of falls away, doesn't it? Because it occurs in other mythology. That wasn't historical.
Well, if it was mythology, but see, we know that Hercules or whatever you mentioned is mythology. We know that. This is being put forth as true, and these are historical characters, which, by the way, in our book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, which I know you have, in chapter 10, I think it is, maybe 9, we list more than 30 historical characters in the New Testament documents that are also in secular sources and or archaeology. So this is a story about real life. It's not Homer or it's not Hercules. It's not mythology. This is put forth as being true, and then there's other evidence that it's true. As you know, being an archaeologist or somebody interested in archaeology, you know there's archaeological evidence for some of these things.
Right, but the existence, being able to verify the historical existence of a person doesn't necessarily mean that you've verified every account of every detail of their life.
You can't verify everything in the New Testament or the Old Testament. You can. But when you get enough evidence to suggest that they're telling the truth, you can take the rest of that and go, well, if they're telling the truth here, they're probably telling the truth here. Have you ever lied to make yourself look good? Yeah, of course you have. Now, have you ever lied to make yourself look bad? No, you would never do that. And the principle of embarrassment goes like this. If there's something embarrassing in the text, it's probably true, because the authors would never make themselves look bad, just like you would never lie to make yourself look bad. Well, the New Testament documents are filled with embarrassing details that they never would have invented. For example, the New Testament writers depict themselves as dim-witted. They don't understand what Jesus is saying. They don't understand his mission. In fact, they don't really get his mission until he's already ascended to heaven. And then they go, wow, I could have had a V8. Up to that point, they didn't know. Peter, their leader, is called Satan by Jesus. That's embarrassing. And of course, Peter says, look, Lord, I'll never deny you. What does he wind up doing? He winds up denying the Lord 3 times. This is their leader. And then if you look in Galatians chapter 2, you see Paul rebuking Peter for being wrong about a theological issue. Why are 2 apostles arguing over theology in the Bible if they're making this up? They're not. It's embarrassing, but they're telling the truth. And then at the crucifixion, the disciples run away. Why would they run away? Why would they admit they ran away? They wouldn't. It must have really happened. And then the first witnesses at the tomb are women. Why would they invent that? In fact, in that culture, a woman's testimony was not considered on par with that of a man. So if you were making up the New Testament resurrection story, you'd only have the men be the first witnesses. Yet all 4 Gospels say the women were the first witnesses, which is telling us what? They really were. They never would have invented it. Never would have invented that. In fact, I had a woman come up to me once and she said, I know why Jesus appeared to the women first. I said, why? And she said, because he wanted to get the story out. And then if you look in Matthew chapter 28, verse 17, this is 2 verses before the so-called Great Commission, when Jesus is standing there and he says, go therefore make disciples of all nations, that passage, as they're standing there, it says the disciples, some believed, but some doubted. How did that verse get in the Bible? He's already resurrected, and they're doubting it's him. Do you think they invented that? No. It's embarrassing. They're just telling the truth. There's even embarrassing details about Jesus. In Mark chapter 3, his own family thinks he's out of his mind. They want to come and seize him to take away. Jesus' family does. Now, you may have heard people say, the scholars say that the New Testament writers invented Jesus to be God. Really? Then why are they saying his own family thinks he's nuts? And he's also called a drunkard. He's called demon-possessed. He has his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute, which easily could have been seen as a sexual advance. And oh, by the way, do you know there are 2 prostitutes in Jesus' bloodline? Rahab and Tamar. Do you think Matthew and Luke got together and said, you know what, I really think we need to spice up the Messiah's bloodline a little bit. Let's put a couple of prostitutes in there. No, I don't think so. They're just telling the truth, as embarrassing as it is. You will never see this in a Pharaoh's bloodline. You will never see the Pharaoh being called a drunkard, being called demon-possessed, or having prostitutes in his bloodline. Any Pharaoh would chop the heads off of his historians if they ever said that, but the New Testament is telling us the truth, as embarrassing as it is. You want the ultimate no-spin zone? Read the Bible.
All right. So the next E is excruciating testimony. So let's take a look at what that is. So excruciating testimony, in other words, what did the New Testament writers have to gain by making up a new religion? Why would they put their lives through excruciating pain to do that? First of all, they already believed they had the true religion in Judaism. They had the true and the living God. They had his law, his word. So why would they make up something different? And again, why would they risk persecution, death, and eternal damnation by defecting from Judaism? Because if Judaism was the end of the story, and if that's what God had revealed to be permanent, then moving on to the new covenant in Christ's blood, that would have only given them pain and misery and risking death, because just like Saul of Tarsus, who became Paul the Apostle, when he was trying to squash Christianity, he saw it as a cult. He saw it as people that were following a false Messiah that deserved the death penalty, because under the law, leading people to worship somebody other than the true and the living God was a death penalty under the law. They had every motive to say that the resurrection did not happen. They had no motive to invent a new storyline. Submission, persecution, servitude, and death are not motivations to claim Jesus rose from the dead, if in fact they knew he actually didn't. Look, a lot of people would die for what they believe to be true but is a lie, but nobody dies for what they know to be a lie. That's insanity. So I think we need to realize that when we look at this. Why would they die for a known lie? People die for lies all the time, but they believe they're dying for something that is true. No one dies for what they know is a lie, especially in multitudes of people claiming to have seen Jesus rise from the dead. All scams break down at the point where death is a possibility, because the advantage of a better, richer, more advantaged life is no longer viable, which a scam offers. But the disciples carried the claim of Jesus risen to their death. So what was the benefit? Did they all become insane? Of course not. Did thousands of people just become insane? No. No, these are actual eyewitnesses of the resurrection, which is why they carried this through.
Another reason we know the New Testament writers are telling the truth is they died for it. They went through excruciating deaths to say that Jesus had resurrected from the dead. They could have saved themselves by simply saying, look, it never happened. Now, these people were Jews. They already thought they were God's chosen people. Why would they invent a resurrected Jesus? Why would they do that if it didn't happen? And then go to their deaths saying that it happened. They wouldn't. You see, many people will die for a lie they think is the truth. There are many people that will die for their religion, but they think it's true. But nobody will die for a lie they know is a lie. The New Testament writers were in a position to know whether it was a lie or not, and they went to their deaths anyway. Why? Because they saw Jesus, they touched Jesus, they ate with Jesus. They verified with their own senses that Jesus had risen from the dead. They were there. and they went and died for it. Remember, they're Jews. They had no motive to make this up. In fact, the New Testament writers did not create the resurrection. The resurrection created the New Testament writers. There would be no New Testament if Jesus had not risen from the dead. Why would Jews invent this? They wouldn't. They went to their deaths because it happened, and you can believe it as well.
All right, so the apostles' beliefs, let's take a look at them before and after the resurrection, their belief and practices. So we have before and after. Before, they practiced animal sacrifice as Jews at the temple. Afterwards, they reverted to Christ's sacrifice. It was one sacrifice for all eternity because he's eternal. It's ever present, as though it had just happened. They had the binding law of Moses upon their life that they lived by, and now they had Christ's life as the example to live by, and they were not under and bound to the law of Moses anymore. It didn't mean that they went out to sin. It just meant that they were not under that old covenant, because that old covenant had certain conditions to it. Strict monotheism. The Jews did not believe in a Trinity. They did not believe that God was had multiple persons within it. However, in Christianity, there is a Trinity. Now, there are hints in the Old Testament, and there is evidence that God was not strictly monotheistic in the sense that he was a single being without multiple persons within the Godhead. And then you get into the New Testament, and then that is revealed. The Trinity, which we've laid out in other presentations, is a truth that, again, has its shadow and anticipation in the Old Testament, but is then revealed in the New. They had the Sabbath, which actually was required for them to observe. It was a death penalty to violate it, but that's because the Sabbath day, Israel, on the Sabbath day, that was the sign of the Mosaic covenant, okay? In the New Testament, it reverted over to Sunday worship. Now, Acts 20, verse 7, Paul says they met on Sundays. This was the day of the Lord's resurrection when he wrote to the Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 16:2, he said, when you get together to meet on the first day of the week. So this was common, and this was not something that a Jew would do. They would not abandon the Sabbath day. They had a conquering Messiah they were anticipating under Judaism, and what came? We had a sacrificial Messiah. Now, he will eventually come to conquer because he'll bring the kingdom in through the nation of Israel. They will be the vehicle for that. However, he came the first time to take care of sin. And the second coming will be dealing with judgment. Circumcision. Before, you had to be circumcised to be in the Abrahamic covenant. And again, that was the sign of the covenant made with Abraham. Afterwards, baptism and communion become the rites and ceremonies that the church practices. But again, those do not bring a person to heaven, but those are kind of memorial things in communion, remembering the Lord's death, and then baptism is the public proclamation where you're claiming to the world you're a Christian and you're identifying yourself with Christ, but that doesn't actually save you. It gets you wet. It's a rite. It's a ceremony, right? But circumcision, actually, Paul dealt with this not only with Barnabas in the book of Acts, chapter 15, in the Jerusalem Council when they met, but also Paul dealt with this in Galatians chapter 2 when he talked about that meeting. What would motivate disciples of Jesus to make these abrupt, drastic changes unless they knew Jesus had risen from the dead? Why would they make their life more miserable for nothing? It just doesn't make any sense. How about the fifth E, expected testimony, things that we would expect. So, through reason and science, we know that God exists and created us for a purpose. In other words, only a theistic God that exists can validate his revelation through miracles. If God exists, then obviously we are here because of him, and that's a miracle, the universe. The fact that it exists, it didn't create itself, so somebody had to create it. And that being that is beyond time, space, and matter, that's infinite, that is God. So he created everything. He's not part of his creation. He's separate from it. But if he performed that miracle, certainly he can perform any other miracle, and he can validate his message through miracles. The Old Testament predicts the Messiah would come in hundreds of prophecies. So, and again, Jesus of Nazareth fulfilled these. That's why, especially in the Gospel of Matthew, as he goes through, Jesus will do something, and he'll say, again, Matthew's writing mainly to the Jews. He works Jesus' genealogy back to Abraham, which the Jews would need in order to validate that this guy was the Messiah. And Matthew says, and this he did, that the scripture would be fulfilled that said. And then every time Jesus does something, he matches it to a fulfillment. That was necessary for the Jews. Otherwise, nobody could claim that he was actually the Messiah. Predictive prophecy is powerful evidence. I mean, look, you can have certain things that people predict, but, you know, it's a 50-50 shot. But when you start adding layer upon layer upon layer, it becomes really mathematically impossible for somebody to fulfill things, especially when they have no control over them, like where you're born. Since the Old Testament teaches the same about the Messiah, the New Testament reliably verifies these Old Testament prophecies. So, they're predicted in the Old Testament, they're fulfilled in the New Testament, at least the ones that were so far, and it connects both the Old and the New Testament together. So, Old Testament prophecies, who? As we look at a few regarding Jesus, he would be human, from Abraham's line in the tribe of Judah. Who? God from eternity, tells us in Micah 5:2. Where? Born in Bethlehem. How? Born of a virgin. Why? To defeat Satan and death. We learn from the verses that are listed there. Why? To be the Savior of the world, because the world needs a Savior. We are sinners. And then when? This prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, when it all gets translated out, tells us that Nehemiah 2 is the start of the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and then the arrival we see in Matthew 21 on what we call Palm Sunday, where Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, Zechariah 9:9, that fulfillment. And between the start and then the end here, in Daniel's calculations, it has to be translated into days because the year model that Daniel used was 360 days, not 365 and a quarter, and it breaks it out to 173,880 days. If you want more information on this, the book by Sir Robert Anderson, The Coming Prince, actually goes through the calculations. It's fascinating. So if you look at it like this, Norm Geisler put together this bullseye chart here, and so he was promised to be of a woman. First prophecy in Genesis 3:15, he'd be in the human race. He would be in the ethnic group of Abraham when God started the nation of Israel from Abraham. And then within Abraham's offspring, and then Joseph, his 12 sons, the 12 tribes, the patriarchs of those tribes, he would be from the tribe of Judah from Genesis 49. Then from the dynasty of David. So we pick one family within the tribe of Judah, which is David's family. He'd be born of a virgin, born in Bethlehem. Now there was two Bethlehems. There was Bethlehem down in Judea, and then there was Bethlehem up north in the Galilee area. The smaller Bethlehem was the one down south. That's where he was picked to be born. When? And then Daniel's prophecy, he hits the bullseye. I mean, this is fascinating. There's no way that this can be arbitrary or by accident. Only Jesus of Nazareth fulfills these. Now, as we go on, Peter Stoner, he wrote a book He was a college professor years ago, wrote a book called Science Speaks. And in chapter 3, Stoner says this. He calculated the probability of just 8 messianic prophecies being fulfilled in the life of Jesus. As you read through these prophecies, you will see that all estimates were calculated as conservatively as possible. Number one, he used him being born in Bethlehem. I mean, obviously, that limits the number of people immediately. He can't be born anyplace else. The messenger that would prepare his way, talking about John the Baptist from Malachi chapter 3. He entered Jerusalem on a donkey from the Zechariah 9:9 quote. He was betrayed by a friend, Zechariah 13:6. He was betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, exactly the amount of money Judas did, right? Zechariah 11. And then that money was used to buy a potter's field, which it was. He made no defense for himself. Isaiah 53, as a lamb before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. And the Messiah will die having his hands and feet pierced. Psalm 22 really depicts the crucifixion quite graphically. Multiplying all these probabilities together produces a number, rounded off, of 1 in 2.8 times 10 to the 28th power. Dividing this number by an estimate of the number of people who have lived since the time of these prophecies, which is 88 billion, produces a probability of all 8 prophecies being fulfilled accidentally in the life of one person. That probability is 1 in 10 to the 18th power, or 1 with 18 zeros after it. In other words, it is mathematically impossible. There is no way that one person can accidentally fulfill these 8, and yet Jesus fulfilled uniquely well over 60. And if you take the duplicate ones by separate eyewitnesses, you're up to a few hundred. So amazing stuff here. And these prophecies don't include, like I said, the hundreds of others. Now, moving on, how about extra biblical testimony, stuff that is actually outside the Bible? Well, Josephus, he said this in his Antiquity of the Jews. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Messiah, the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day. Let's see. As the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day. So this is not the only time Josephus mentions Jesus. Now again, he was a Jew who wrote for the Romans. He wrote down history. Why would he do that? I mean, look, Jesus is mentioned in the Babylonian Talmud. Why would the Jews even mention him if he didn't exist? I mean, they mention him in a derogatory way, but they mention him, right? They criticize him. Josephus goes on. It says, Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, talking about James, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. Annas, the high priest, took advantage, and this is how this happened. Annas, the high priest, and again, remember earlier it said, Luke tells us Annas and Caiaphas were high priests. Well, Annas was the actual one. Took advantage of the 3-month gap between the death of Festus and Albinus, who had not yet made it to Judea to take his place. So there was a gap there was a temporary time where there was actually no Roman leader there. The New Testament indicates that James was the pastor of the church at Jerusalem, a difficult position to have if Jesus didn't exist. Interesting. He didn't believe till after he was resurrected anyways. Now, they found this ossuary. On it, it says, James, the son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. The ossuary was from Jesus' stepbrother, and they estimated it's between 20 BC and 70 AD. In other words, that's the age of it by their examination. Josephus said Jesus was executed in AD 62. Now, it was unusual to have the brother of a deceased listed on the inscription. There was a court case in 2008 that actually verified the authenticity of the inscription, which is amazing. So, basic New Testament storyline is really confirmed by non-Christian sources. There are 10 ancient non-Christian sources, including, number one, historians, Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, Thallus, and Phlegon. So these are historians that validate things that we have in the New Testament. Government officials, Pliny the Younger, Emperor Trajan, and the Emperor Hadrian. Other sources include the Jewish Talmud and the Greek writer Lucian. Compiling their references, we get a story contingent with the New Testament, actually without reading the New Testament. In other words, if we look at what they say about the New Testament, it correlates to what we get when we read the New Testament. Number one, Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. This is what we get from them. He lived a virtuous life. He was a wonder worker. He had a brother named James. He was acclaimed to be the Messiah. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. An eclipse and earthquake occurred when he died. He was crucified on the eve of the Passover. His disciples believed he rose from the dead. His disciples were willing to die for their belief. Christianity spread rapidly as far as Rome. His disciples denied the Roman gods and worshiped Jesus as God. This is what the New Testament says without the New Testament. It's quite a testimony from outside the Bible. This is from I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Just how many non-Christian sources are there that mention Jesus, including Josephus? There are 10 now non-Christian writers, known non-Christian writers, who mention Jesus within 150 years of his life. By contrast, over the same 150 years, there are 9 non-Christian sources who mention Tiberius Caesar, the Roman emperor, at the time of Jesus. So discounting all the Christian sources, Jesus is actually mentioned by one or more source than the Roman emperor. If you include the Christian sources, authors mentioning Jesus outnumber those mentioning Tiberius 43-10. Some of these non-Christian sources, such as Celsus, Tacitus, and the Jewish Talmud, could be considered anti-Christian sources. They were not in favor of Jesus. So, again, these are sources outside the Bible that corroborate what is in it. Now, Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea. Now, this stone was discovered actually in 1961, not very long ago. And they estimate its date was between 26 and 37 AD. So here comes Turek. He's going to give you an explanation. He always does a much better job than I do.
Another biblical character we know who existed via archaeology is Pontius Pilate. In 1961, in the coastal town of Caesarea in northern Israel, a stone was discovered which says Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. We not only know he existed from this stone, but Josephus, the Jewish historian who lived from 37 AD to about 100 AD, mentions Pontius Pilate in his writings. He also mentions Jesus. He also mentions James. and John the Baptist and some other characters in the Bible. We know these people actually existed from archaeology, some of them, and also from writers like Josephus.
So, how about the ossuary of Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest? He was the other one, other than Annas, and that was discovered in 1990, very recent. And you can see the inscription there, though we can't actually read it. But again, Frank Turek is going to give you a great explanation.
One of the most fascinating archaeological discoveries which authenticates a major character in the Bible is the Caiaphas ossuary. This was discovered in 1990 in Jerusalem. What's an ossuary? It's a limestone box that the Jews used from about 20 BC to 70 AD. What would happen if somebody important died? They would inter the body about a year later. They would take the bones out of the grave and put them in this ossuary, this limestone box, and reinter the remains. Well, in 1990, they discovered this very ornate ossuary that on the side of it identified the remains as the remains of Caiaphas. Who is Caiaphas? He was the high priest that sentenced Jesus to die. When Jesus said, "I am the Messiah, and you will see the Son of Man coming with great power on the clouds," Caiaphas tore his robe and said, "Blasphemy, this man must die." The man that sentenced Jesus to die, we not only know he existed, we have his bones. When they discovered this ossuary, they discovered the bones of a 60-year-old man and his family. There's only one Caiaphas known from history, and that's the Caiaphas of the New Testament who sentenced Jesus to die. We not only know he existed, we have his burial box.
All right, now, excuse me, the Pool of Bethesda. Excavations have found the 5 porches or colonnades located a short distance from the sheep gate as described in John 5:2. That's the Pool of Bethesda story where Jesus healed a man lame for 38 years. And they also have, they found in 1968, some bones of a victim that was crucified. So it demonstrates that the Romans were crucifying, which we know, people at that time. However, the archaeological discovery shows you how they actually did it. In other words, where they did it, and how they put the nails through. Again, exactly like the New Testament tells us. So finally, the 7th E is elaborate testimony. So elaborate testimony, and this is very interesting to me. Lying just below the surface of the New Testament narrative is an elaborate series of interlocking puzzle pieces that reveal that the New Testament documents contain independent eyewitnesses of actual historical events. Details in one writer's account inadvertently fill in the gaps of another writer's account. I say inadvertently because these details are too subtle, elaborate, and widespread to have been planned or contrived. Cambridge professor J.J. Blunt identified over 60 of these instances in the New Testament alone and called them undesigned coincidences. You can actually get this book off of the internet if you look it up in, just do a search on it, you'll find it. So this quote is from Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case by Frank Turek. Again, another excellent book. I would highly recommend it. So Blunt's book, if you go to archive.org and then type it in, you should be able to find it and download it so that you can read it for yourself. Now, Pilate and Jesus. Here's one example out of the book. Luke records the Jews bringing accusations against Jesus to Pilate. we found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ the King. And Pilate asked him, Are you the King of the Jews? And he answered him, You have said so. Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. So the red is the emphasis, right? How is it that they accused him of being a king? Pilate asked him if he was a king. He admitted that he was, but he also found no guilt in him. Now, he should have found some guilt in him because it meant that he was a competing king with Caesar. That's the whole issue, right? So here's the puzzle. Jesus admits he's guilty as charged, so why does Pilate say he's not guilty, right? Baffling. The answer, the puzzle piece, it's only baffling until you read John's account. Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, Are you the King of the Jews? Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. Pilate went back outside to the Jews and told them, I find no guilt in him. Now, the answer, right, very clearly, putting the pieces together, John offers information not provided by Luke, since Jesus said his kingdom is not of this world. He was not challenging Caesar's rule as accused, therefore Pilate found no guilt in him. Now, again, Turek gives you this example in stealing from God, but here's the point. So many times when you have an eyewitness testimony, you have things that are just stated. They have that today in court cases. It's not, eyewitness testimony is not developed, hey, we're going to have to go to court. Let's make sure that we see this and witness this the way that it's going to correlate the way people would like with everybody else's witness. Well, that's not possible. That's not how things actually happen. That's why you need detectives. That's why you need to put elbow grease into detective work so that you don't send the wrong person to jail. So it's the same here. I mean, you got to put some elbow grease into the New Testament and the whole Bible, really, because when you have something that is just related historically, you have people stating something. Now, it made sense, certainly, to the people at the time that they were writing to because they were part of that culture and they knew what went on, and now you're just giving the eyewitness detail to it. But now we're 2,000 years removed from that. So you have to look at all the sources, all the New Testament sources, and put them together. And what Blunt did, he was saying, hey, it's not like Luke said, I'm going to leave this piece out, but I'll let John fill it in later. He didn't know that John was going to fill it in. That wasn't the point. The point is that under the surface, they connect. And there's a number of these. They're all over the place because it's eyewitness detail. And they don't plot this. It just happens because it's true. This kind of testimony reveals the veracity of the New Testament writers. Eyewitness testimony always has to be investigated to discover the interlocking pieces, no different than real-life crime scene. For example, they can initially appear to be possible contradictions on the surface. This reveals the writers were not in collusion. And then, each writer, the Gospels in our case, must be analyzed to discover the pieces needed to clear up the questions. This reveals the writers were most likely unaware that there were missing pieces were in their own eyewitness description or were unconcerned about them. So, it's just normal stuff. And it's what God wanted. It's inspired by God. He wanted the pieces to be as real as possible because they represented actual eyewitness testimony. Now, the connections many times require a knowledge of customs or culture in the time of the writing. This reveals the writers assumed the readers would have some knowledge of these details because they wrote at the time that the readers were alive, obviously. Each New Testament writer provides information that is only a piece of information that is not always necessarily of high value to their own account, but when analyzed, answers to other eyewitness accounts. This reveals it was unplanned detail, for it makes should be no sense to require the eyewitness account of another to clear up any perceived missing pieces to a story, obviously, right? I mean, we don't want to write a story and then say, okay, well, I'm going to leave these gaps that don't make any sense to people in years to come. I'll leave it up to somebody else to fill in the gap. They don't do that. But this is how legitimate eyewitness accounts actually occur. With the sheer number of these in the New Testament alone, it would be impossible to pre-plan all underlying pieces and have them fit unless they were actual eyewitness accounts. That's the point. This is the elaborate testimony that we're talking about.
Let's look at some interlocking puzzle pieces from non-Christian writers. This is sometimes called extra-biblical writers or extra-biblical testimony. So these aren't people writing in the Bible. These are people like Josephus and Tacitus and Suetonius. These are writers who lived around that time who are giving us details about that era. And let's start in Matthew. Why avoid Herod Archelaus? Who is Archelaus? Archelaus is one of the sons of Herod the Great. When Herod the Great died in 6 BC, his kingdom was divided up, and one of his sons was Archelaus. And Archelaus got the section of the kingdom that included Jerusalem. And so he was the ruler from 4 BC to about 6 AD, so about 10 years. And as you read Matthew, he leaves a puzzle, because here's what Matthew records, that Joseph had a dream in Egypt to return to Israel with Mary and the child Jesus. But when Joseph heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. Now, Galilee is to the north in Israel, and of course Jerusalem is the area whereby Archelaus is in charge, or where Archelaus is in charge. There is no explanation as to who Archelaus is. There's no explanation as to why Joseph would want to avoid this area. So it seems to me the puzzle is this: why is Archelaus so scary? Somebody not in the Bible tells us. In fact, this man is the greatest Jewish historian of the time. His name is Titus Josephus. He lived from 37 AD to 100 AD. And he was one of the rebels against the Romans in 66 AD when the Jews tried to boot the Romans out. That did not end well, because what happened in 70 AD? The temple in the entire country basically was overrun by the Romans, and the temple has not been rebuilt to this day. So when Jesus says to them in Matthew chapter 24 that not one stone will be left upon another, and then they ask him, well, when are these things going to occur? And he says, before this generation passes away, these things are going to occur. He says, you will see the Son of Man coming in power on the clouds. And everyone's thinking that's a reference to the end of the world. No, it's not. It's a reference to 70 AD. He said that in 30 AD. What's a generation? 40 years. 40 years later, 70 AD, the Roman army descends upon Jerusalem, and they wipe out Jerusalem. They wipe out the temple. Josephus said there was nothing left. Now, what's all this business about coming in the clouds? What could you see? By the way, Jerusalem's elevated. What could you see from 100 miles if an army was coming on Jerusalem? A cloud of dust. In fact, in the Old Testament, in Isaiah 19, it says Yahweh rides a cloud of judgment against Egypt. The reference to the clouds is the army coming. Jesus is saying that Jerusalem would be judged because they rejected the Messiah within a generation. And there it was. This guy talks about it in a couple of works that he has done. One is called Antiquities. And here's what he says about Archelaus. Matthew doesn't explain, but the Jewish historian Josephus does, in putting out a disturbance at the temple in 4 BC, so he's just taken over. Archelaus sent in troops into the temple and slaughtered 3,000 Jews. Passover that year was canceled. He tries to assert his authority as soon as he takes over. He murders 3,000 Jews. They cancel Passover. A whole bunch of Jews are probably going back on the road toward Egypt. And Joseph and Mary and the baby Jesus are on their way back going, where are you guys going? Isn't it Passover? Archelaus, haven't you heard? He just slaughtered 3,000 of our brethren. Passover's been canceled. So what's Joseph doing? I'm not going to where that homicidal maniac is. I just left that area to escape a homicidal maniac. His father, I'm not going back there. I'm going to go to Galilee. Right? But you don't get that from the Bible. You get that from Josephus. And Josephus is writing about 40 years after this. So here comes an outside source, Josephus, and he says Matthew is reliable. Next one, number 2. Why did they take Jesus to the temple when he was 12? Why not 10? Why not 11? In fact, if you look at Luke, he raises a question. It says every year Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover. Every year. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the feast according to the custom, and they took Jesus with them. And you know the rest of the story. He's then found in the temple after they... And by the way, isn't this just like about 12-year-old kids? You know, when you go in a group with their friends, you're thinking, well, their parents are watching him. And their parents are thinking, well, you're watching his kid, you know. And somehow Jesus gets left out of the whole gaggle. And he's in the temple, and nobody notices it until they're halfway home. Where's Jesus? I thought he was with you. No, I thought he was with you. Where is he? And they go back and they find him in the temple. But why would they go down there when he's 12? Why not 11? Why not 10? Why not 13? Why 12? And why did his parents go without him until 12? Again, Josephus may answer the question. In the 10th year of Archelaus' government, both his brethren and the principal men of Judea and Samaria, not being able to bear his barbarous and tyrannical usage of them, accused him before Caesar. Caesar, upon hearing what certain accusers of his had to say and what reply he could make, banished Archelaus to a city in Gaul, which is present-day France. So the people basically rebelled against Archelaus by going to Caesar and saying, this guy's a psycho. We want somebody else. And so they hear all this. Caesar does, and he says, Archelaus, what do you have to say for yourself? Apparently Archelaus did not do a good job in defense. You're gone. He took all his property from him, sent him to France. What year was that? That's about the time Jesus would have been 12. You say, wasn't Jesus born in 0? First of all, there's no 0 year, okay? But no, the way the calendar goes, he was born around 6 BC, sometime between 4 and 6 BC, okay? So why did they bring him when he's 12? Because Archelaus is gone. Archelaus is no longer a threat. So they avoided bringing Jesus into Archelaus' territory when Archelaus was there. As soon as they figured out that Archelaus is gone, he's deposed, he's in France, I guess it's safe to take the boy down to Jerusalem. Let's go. Now, is that a little bit of speculation? Yeah, but it's quite interesting, isn't it? In fact, now you've got Josephus also now verifying Luke.
All right, so we have some more that we're going to go through regarding that, but we're at an hour, so, or actually a couple minutes over, so I want to end here. We'll pick it up the next time, but again, may God richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.